When I was in journalism school, one of my instructors told me to stand outside a sex shop and ask random people what they were using to masturbate. Okay, that's a bit of an oversimplification. Let me tell you what actually happened. I'm Kate Sloan, and this is Making Magic: How the Magic Wand Became the World's Most Famous Vibrator. So I was working on a huge feature story about the magic wand for a school assignment, like I told you a couple episodes ago. I was interviewing people about their experiences with this legendary vibrator, and many of them actually let me into their homes to take notes and ask them questions while they used the wand by themselves or with a partner. But needless to say, not very many people were open to inviting this random student with a notebook and pen into their house to grill them about their orgasms. One day we had a guest speaker come into class to talk to us about our stories in progress. He was this old school newspaper reporter who'd won a bunch of awards for his writing about business and sports, among other things. When it was my turn to get his advice, I explained the premise of my article and that my main struggle at that time was finding more people to interview. The guest speaker said, "Have you tried talking to people at sex shops yet?" I said, "Yeah, I've talked to a few salespeople." He said, "No, I mean you should stand outside a sex shop, and when someone comes out with a shopping bag, ask them if they bought a magic wand, and if they did, then interview them on the spot." I was really thrown off by this. I tried to explain that a lot of people feel deep shame about going into a sex shop at all, let alone buying something, let alone being accosted by a nosy stranger on the doorstep afterward. But this man insisted, "You need to be bolder. That's what it takes to be a journalist." I still disagree with him, even now, nearly a decade later. I know from my work in sex journalism and sex toy retail that most people have sexual shame to some extent. And when you're talking to someone who's actively confronting that shame, you have to be calm, non-judgmental, and most of all, compassionate. One bad interaction can be enough to leave emotional scars, and can even change someone's whole life direction. That's exactly what happened to Dell Williams at Macy's department store in the 1970s.
Dell Williams' experience shopping for a magic wand in Macy's was really a defining moment for her, and I would say a defining moment for feminist sex toy history.
This is Lynn Camella, a professor of gender and sexuality studies, who also literally wrote the book on feminist sex toy history. It's called Vibrator Nation. I'll let her tell you this part of Dell's story, along with Hallie Lieberman, the sex toy historian who wrote Buzz.
Dell Williams, an ad executive and actress and member of the New York City National Organization for Women, went to a yoga retreat with Betty. Betty told her all what she was doing. Dell was very interested.
You remember Betty Dodson, the sex educator who used to hand out magic wands at her all-nude masturbation workshops. I wasn't kidding when I said she influenced countless people in the industry, and Dell was one of them. Dell attended one of those workshops after meeting Betty.
Betty was like showing these vibrators, and Dell's like, "I have to have one for my homework to masturbate with a vibrator."
And after that workshop, feeling very empowered and stepping into this new sense of sexual self-confidence, she marched down to Macy's department store and went into the electronics department and asked for the magic wand.
Dell had already had to contend with so much shame and confusion about sex in her life, growing up in the 1930s when sex education in schools was practically non-existent. So I can't even imagine how much courage it took for her to seek out that magic wand and bring it up to the cash register.
And instead of, the clerk just scanning it and it's over, he goes, "What do you want that for? What are you using that for?" I do think that it was a shaming or kind of put people in their place thing. 'Cause why else would you ask that? You're trying to humiliate someone. And it's so shitty.
And so whatever sense of self-confidence she marched in there with slowly evaporated, and she was left feeling embarrassed.
She got really embarrassed, really uncomfortable, and I think mumbled something about her back and checked out. But that shame she felt then led her to start the first feminist sex toy store, Eve's Garden, in 1974.
Because it was in that moment that Williams realized, women should really be selling these items to other women. There needs to be some kind of business that is making these things available and accessible to women so they don't have these types of experiences, so they don't have to feel shame for investing in their sexuality, investing in their pleasure. She was in her early 50s when she started Eve's Garden, and she started it in her kitchen, in her apartment, right? Kind of selling vibrators by mail. And word started to get out about this new vibrator business that was catering to women. And she started opening up her apartment, her Midtown apartment, on Friday nights. And women would come and kind of look at the vibrators in person. And then, shortly thereafter, she opened up her first showroom, right, where people could kind of come and see the products and be reliant solely on mail order. It was just such a different sex toy market in the early 1970s. It was not this cornucopia of sex toys that you would get today if you walked into a sex toy shop, right? Like where there's just dozens upon dozens upon dozens of vibrators, brightly colored, well-made, good quality.
She only carried 3 products: Hitachi Magic Wand, Betty Dodson's Liberating Masturbation, another vibrator called the Prelude. That's it.
And I think one of the things that was so important about the Magic Wand was it was a quality product in a sea of products that at the time were not well made. They were not designed to last. Of the selection that did exist, the Magic Wand was well made, it was durable, it was powerful, it did its job, and word spread. It just became a dependable vibrator right out of the gate.
So yes, that was the beginning, and it was saying the Magic Wand is like the device that we are using to liberate ourselves from the, sexual strictures of the time, from, the idea that men have to provide us with sexual pleasure, that we can't do that on our own, which was so revolutionary. In archives, I've read letters from women to Dell Williams saying, wow, I had never had an orgasm in 20 years of marriage, bought a vibrator, now I have one, and I'm divorcing my husband. Dell Williams wrote in a 1990 article, she said, before taking Dodson's workshop and using a Hitachi Magic Wand, she only had disdain for vibrators. I couldn't quite believe that a mechanical device could impart such good feelings, such joy, she wrote. Our magic wands transported us to a carpet of clouds where each of us was carried by our own delicious bodily feelings to higher and higher places of expansion, light, and self-love.
Dell Williams' unabashed love and revere for vibrators was ultimately one of the things that made her such a trailblazer, and she spread that gospel far and wide. She was the first person to start a feminist sex shop in the US, but she certainly wasn't the last. Just a few years after Eve's Garden opened in New York City, another feminist icon was about to bring some good vibrations to the West Coast as well.
Good Vibrations was founded in 1977 by Joani Blank, who was a sex educator and therapist, and also an author who was already writing self-help books for women and men around their sexuality. Historically, adult stores of the late 60s, early 70s were really, geared towards men, their desires, their pleasures, and women factored in more as objects of male desire, not as sexual subjects. Similar to Dell Williams, Joani Blank wanted to change that, maybe level the playing field. And again, in the 1970s, it was increasingly the case that women were hearing from many different places, from people like Betty Dodson, from books they were reading, from within the women's liberation movement, from within sex therapy, that vibrators were their friends, that their sex lives might be better. Their orgasms could be stronger, or if they weren't having them at all, which was for some women the case, that vibrators could change that.
Joani was younger than Dell, and her professional background was quite different from Dell's, but there were some key things they had in common. Namely, they'd both been heavily influenced by Betty Dodson's work.
She had learned, as everybody pretty much did in those days, about the magic wand from Betty. Then Dell learned about the magic wand from Betty also. And so, all paths kind of led back to Betty's apartment in those days, I guess.
This is Dr. Carol Queen again, staff sexologist at Good Vibes and curator of its Antique Vibrator Museum. She told me about another thing Dell and Joani had in common, which was that they were both very selective about what their stores would stock.
When Joani Blank started Good Vibrations in 1977, she only sold a tiny handful of things, actually. There were not very many books in print that she thought were good enough to sell and carry. The dildos were hidden in the filing cabinet, and you had to ask for them by name. But of the half dozen or 8 vibrators that she carried in the very first size of a postage stamp Good Vibes store in the Mission District in San Francisco, the magic wand really held pride of place.
One of the things that Joani was really committed to was trying to keep the price point relatively low.
Joani was so sure that the magic wand needed to be in every hand who was ready to grasp one. And she was not quite hand to mouth, but she was spending the money she made last week on the stuff she was going to sell a week or two in the future. And if she couldn't get a shipment of magic wands in time after they had run out, she would run down to Japantown in San Francisco, where the import stores were that carried the magic wand, and buy a case or two to tide her over. You could get them by the case if you had that much magic that you needed to conjure.
And she would come back and sell those products in Good Vibrations for the tiniest little bit of markup. So she was making not a lot, maybe $2 off of every sale was profit,
Joani Blank wanted Good Vibrations to do 2 main things: to make good quality products, as few of them as she considered there were at the time, available, especially to women. And she wanted to provide enough information that people could use them successfully and with pleasure. She knew that sex information was entwined in successful selling of sexual products for a populace, especially a just getting started with playing with this stuff populace who hadn't gotten good sex information and didn't know where to start and didn't know what to do next. So a lot of informational books, a lot of taking the time to explain anatomy, a lot of all of that was always baked in to Good Vibrations. And pretty soon people were grasping things about their own erotic anatomy that they had never been taught by anybody else. And if they were really lucky people, they had just discovered it on their way, but not everyone was and is that lucky.
This, to me, is the most striking thing about Joani's work and legacy when I look back at it, her focus on sex education, and how far that credo has spread. I went to a sex shop for the first time when I was a teenager, and it was a woman-owned, queer and trans-friendly, feminist store with an emphasis on inclusivity, non-judgment, and providing accurate information to shoppers as needed. I later worked at 2 different sex shops where these same values were drilled into me during training. This approach to selling sex toys seems kind of obvious now, given that a lot of people experience shame, confusion, and ignorance around sex and masturbation. But back in the 70s, it wasn't obvious at all. I have no idea what sex shops would be like today if Joani Blank hadn't come along, and I'm glad I won't ever have to find out. Actually, one of my very favorite sex shops in the world was directly influenced by Joani, which I didn't know until I started working on this series.
My name is Jack Lehman, and my job title at Come As You Are is technically worker owner.
Come As You Are is my local feminist sex toy store. Whenever I drop by to stock up on lube or condoms or bondage rope, I'm amazed by how comfortable I feel there, which is not a feeling most people associate with visiting sex shops. Unusually for a sex shop, though, Come As You Are is a co-op, meaning that its employees are also part owners and participate democratically in decision-making about the business. this, too, was influenced by Joani.
We were founded in the sort of model of Good Vibrations in California, which was a worker-owned cooperative at the time. They became a worker-owned co-op, and then Joani Blank, really out of the goodness of her heart, started teaching other folks how to open feminist sex shops in their areas. So, Babeland was a recipient of that knowledge. Good for her. Come as you are. They all partook in these trainings. She was amazing, and she was actually our first investor.
The term feminist sex shop itself has been defined and redefined in different ways by different people over the years, as feminism itself has shifted and changed.
What feminist sex shops were like in the kind of first wave of feminist sex toy store retailing was really different from what many of them look like today. But the thing that unites them are a real emphasis on medically accurate sex education and also, trying to be a different kind of space. Both Eve's Garden and Good Vibrations really wanted to differentiate their places of business from the stereotypical adult store. If the stereotypical adult store was seen as dimly lit and quote-unquote seedy, they were going to make their stores brightly lit and really inviting, welcoming spaces. They were going to, emphasize a very knowledgeable, well-trained staff that could answer questions not just about the product, but about maybe other sexual questions a customer might have. They were going to carry a wide selection of books about sex, which, was not necessarily something you would find in more standard adult retailers. But I think some of that initial work was limited because there was somewhat of an essentialist view around female sexuality and what women wanted. The initial product selection very much catered to what the owners thought women like them wanted. So it wasn't a very expansive idea of, what women wanted, right? So you hear these stories about Joani Blank initially kind of keeping dildos out of sight in a kind of file cabinet because, she wasn't sure what kind of reception those would get. And it was just easier to kind of keep them hidden. And if somebody asked for them, she would have them, but she didn't have them out in the way that she had vibrators out.
But I feel like, when you look at the shops that were opened in the 90s and the early 2000s that were feminist, they tended to reflect a third wave feminist ideology, which was, inherently sex positive in its nature. Sex positive feminism was directly in response to the so-called lesbian porn wars or the lesbian sex wars. Which were really about, questions about could pornography ever be ethical and feminist?
Joani Blank personally didn't like porn.
Could BDSM ever be ethical and feminist? And so you did see this, groundswell of feminist sex shops that were taking up the ideology that, yes, porn under the right conditions can be feminist and as can BDSM.
My favorite sex shops today proudly display big veiny dildos alongside their vibrators. They shelve books of kinky erotica alongside books about self-love. They'll sell you a hardcore porn DVD with your massage oil and feather tickler. These spaces have evolved because feminism has evolved, and rightly so. As the movement itself has made strides toward being more inclusive of kinksters, sex workers, queer and trans people, people of color, asexual people, disabled people, and so many others, many feminist sex shops have worked to welcome all types of people too. Including men, by the way, despite the common misconception that feminism is an anti-man movement.
There were lots of stories that people shared with me about just the conversations, in the late 80s and early 90s at Good Vibrations about what extent should they be marketing to men. And those were really somewhat contentious conversations, right? Because some people really didn't think that their precious marketing money, their advertising dollars needed to go to men, right? Because men already had all these stores. The people that they really needed to reach were those folks that kind of were on the margins, right? That didn't feel part of this world, that weren't being encouraged to grab a hold of their sexuality. Where did men, heterosexual, cisgender men fit into the good vibrations world. And I remember, I think it was Carol Queen said to me during an interview, I think that those debates got settled in part because the owners and staff of Good Vibrations finally realized, that men's money was also green and that they couldn't discount a huge percentage of their customer base. And Joani Blank always wanted the store to be inclusive. Make no mistake about it. Her tagline was always especially but not exclusively for women. A lot of feminist retailers had to figure out how to communicate to their potential customer base that feminism was not shorthand for women only. And I assume that work continues to be ongoing, right? It's not sex toys for women or sex toys for men, right? It's sex toys for people. These things don't have to be gendered.
It's fascinating to me that feminist sex shops have been around for about 50 years and have changed along with society in the subsequent decades, but have retained a few things all this time that they still hold dear. They're still largely committed to sex education, to destigmatization, and of course to feminism itself, and they still sell the magic wand. Seriously, I have yet to visit a feminist sex shop that doesn't have at least one magic wand product in its lineup. The wand is practically the mascot for sex-positive feminism at this point. After learning all this history, I thought I'd check in with some more people who are working in feminist sex toy retail today.
My name is Carly S. I am a blogger and pleasure educator. I do the product management for Spectra Boutique.
Hi, this is Andy Duran. I'm the education director for Good Vibrations and Babeland.
I was curious about whether Carly and Andy still see the magic wand as a cult favorite, the way it was in Dell Williams and Joani Blank's heydays. I started off by asking them how they had first encountered the wand.
I had seen it in porn and not really given it too much thought. And then I got one at a training for my first job at a sex shop. And I was like, oh, I'm never going to use this. And my partner at the time was like, oh, we're going to use this. And we used it, and I was like, oh my God, this is the thing that I had been missing in my life. How have I never used this before?
So before I started working at Good Vibes had actually come out to lots of community events or classes that I was attending and taught workshops and would show toys. And that was probably my first time seeing the magic wand. I was kind of, it's interesting in its look, but I didn't know its full potential right away.
I was always someone who used pocket rockets, which is just those cheap plastic vibrators with the one speed that had those caps on it. And I was someone that always used to press really hard and break the caps and break those vibrators. And not only does the magic wand have the strength that I was looking for that I didn't even know I was looking for, but it's so much easier to hold.
Do people ask for the magic wand specifically at your store?
Oh, so often. People definitely know it by name, even if they have no idea what it looks like, which is really interesting. So folks will say, I'm looking for the wand or the magic something, and we go to it, and then they see it, and their eyes get real big because they had no idea it was a large external toy or anything else. They just only heard of the reputation. That's a very common one.
People ask for it by name, especially Hitachi, which is more what people knew it by. And it was really funny, especially I worked a lot of Friday and Saturday late nights, and we were surrounded by bars, and people would come in and ask for the hibachi, and I'd always chuckle, and I'm like, I know what you mean, but this is very funny to me.
I actually think that it's word of mouth, largely, that folks who have had their kind of conversations about some of these really notable types of toys, magic wand, the rabbit, things like this, where they've heard of the fables before they've actually had the chance to see it in real life. It's a mythical product almost. And then when they see it, it's now how do I use this? What do I do with this? Because it's not necessarily intuitive from the design.
There was one girl who definitely bought it while drunk at brunch on liquid courage, and called the next day trying to return it. And I was like, girl, I told you that there's no returns. I definitely made sure at the register because you seemed a little out of it. And you were like, no, I'm sure. And I was like, okay. And, listen, of all the things that you could get stuck with, there could be way worse things. At worst, you'll have a back massager.
One of the reasons I wanted to make this series in the first place was that I think it's interesting how the magic wand and feminism are kind of intertwined with each other in a way you don't often see with consumer products. Tell the story of the magic wand and you'll inevitably touch on sex-positive feminism. Tell the story of sex-positive feminism and you'll inevitably touch on the magic wand. It's not that vibrators themselves are inherently feminist, they're just objects, but this particular object was hugely important to some people who were themselves hugely important to the movement. A powerful vibrator gives its users a way to access pleasure, regardless of whether they have a partner or whether that partner meets their needs, sexually or otherwise. It makes sense to me that a sex toy like the magic wand could take on such a significant role in a movement that's about, among other things, marginalized people taking our pleasure and our power into our own hands. Today we talked about some of the people who made the magic wand famous, but in the next episode we'll learn more about the magic wand itself, from its humble beginnings as a quote-unquote body massager produced by Hitachi to its modern iterations like the magic wand rechargeable and magic wand mini. We'll also finally answer the question, why isn't the Hitachi name on the magic wand anymore, despite the fact that a lot of people still refer to it simply as the Hitachi? Until then, keep on making magic. Making Magic is hosted and co-produced by me, Kate Sloan, edited and co-produced by Jamie Pittenger, and made possible by the generous support of Vibratex, with art by Addison Finch. Special thanks to my guests for this episode, Dr. Lynn Camella, Dr. Carol Queen, Hallie Lieberman, Jack Lehman, Carly S., and Andy Duran. You can find links to their work in the show notes.